Welcome back to Introduction to XPages Development, a video blog series at pauldn.com. Part 3, Display a Domino View on an XPage. This blog series is based on the Introduction to XPages Development course, a free course available for download from tlcc.com. In this part in the series, I'll be focusing on this lesson in Module 2, Display a Domino View on an XPage. We saw this graphic in Part 1 of this series. In a traditional notes or domino application, the majority of the user interface is provided by forms and views. Forms are used to create and display and update documents. Views are used to organize and sort a collection of documents in a database. In this Part 3 in this series, we'll be focusing on this part of the UI, displaying a domino view on an XPage. So to display a domino view on an XPage, we need to add a domino view data source for the view we want to display, and then add the appropriate XPage control to render the domino view, like a view panel control or a data view control. Turning to my Notes workspace, I see my applications which will provide the data sources for my XPages, the customers, parts, and sales applications. I also see Design NSF, the new empty database that I created in Part 2 in this series. I'm going to continue to add all of my XPages resources into Design NSF, and for this part, I'll be specifying a domino view data source in the Customers application. When we open Customers, we see there are several views. This Customer by Name view will be the data source for the XPage we create, and on that XPage, we're going to show the Customers column. And we're going to show some other columns, the city and the contact and the phone column as well. Some of these will be sortable, like the city, contact as well, not the phone, that won't be sortable. There are two methods for adding a view control to an XPage. You can use the controls palette or you can use the data palette to add a view control to an XPage. The first approach is the more common approach. First, select the view control from the controls palette, and then select the location on the XPage for the view control. At this point, you're interrupted with a dialog to select the domino view data source for the view control. With the second approach, you've already added a domino view data source to the XPage, and the view schema, that is, the columns available for the view, are listed in the data palette. You can then simply select the columns to add and then drag and drop them onto your XPage. The result is a view control added to the XPage with just those columns that were selected and dropped from the data palette. And like other controls, you select the view control in the outline, to select it in the design editor, and also to show its properties and to set its properties in the properties view. Switching to Designer, I have my working set open for the course databases. Design.nsf is the application I created in Part 2, where I created my first XPage and my styles, with its margins 25 style class to add a 25 pixel margin around my panel controls. I'll rearrange my applications navigator, and I'm going to create my new XPage here in design.nsf. But first, let's take a look at the data source for this XPage, and that will be here in this Customers application, and specifically in our views, the Customer by Name view. So let's open that up. And here it is in Designer. And I can see the columns that I want to show, the customer column and city and the contact column as well. And phone. This sales order lookup column, not going to add that. This is used for some internal @db column lookups. Not going to need it in my XPage application, so I won't add this to my view panel control. Notice also that the first three columns are sortable. So when we look at the sort properties for the contact column, we see this option here. Click on column header to sort in both directions. And for the phone column, that option is not selected. So that applies to the first three columns. And another thing to notice is the programmatic use name for these columns. So when you go into the advanced properties, we can see customer is the programmatic use name for customer, and city for city, and contact for contact. And for the phone column, it is $1. So the phone column, its value, what it's showing in its column, was derived with a formula. So Notes automatically added this $1 programmatic use name for this particular column. So something to keep in mind if you want to address that column. Let me close that view and application. And now here in my navigator, selecting my XPages view for design.nsf and creating a new XPage, giving it the name Customers by Name View. And I could add a data source at this time when I'm creating the application, but instead I'll add my view panel first, so just say OK. And I get my blank Customer by Name View XPage. And the first thing that I always like to do is add a panel to contain whatever I'm putting on this XPage. So I'll add a panel. And then I can identify that panel. Call this one Panel 1. And then on the Style tab, I'll add Margins 25, but I don't see Margins 25 at Style class. And that's because I haven't added my Styles style sheet for this XPage. So in my outline, selecting my XPage, and on the Resources tab, I'm going to add for this XPage a style sheet, and I'll choose mystyles.css as the style sheet. And now when I select my panel in the outline and go to my properties for my panel on the Style tab, I can now add Margins 25, that style class. Now into my Style panel, I can add a View control. And when I drag that into my panel and drop it, I'm prompted to choose a data source. So I could choose a Domino View data source in the current application. That's not what I want. I want to choose a Domino View data source in another application. So I'll navigate to the TLCC demo, the correct path to choose my customers application, and it has a file name of xp9 cust.nsf. That's the one I want, so I'll choose that database. And then the second part of this is choose a view from that database, and I'm choosing the Customer by Name view from that database to specify my data source. By default, the data source name is View1, and I can change that to a more descriptive name, and that would be the programmatic handle for that data source. I'm going to just leave the default of View1. Notice a programmatic name for my various columns. Also notice this sales order lookup column, that hidden column. I'll deselect that because I don't want to show that in my view control. So with these four selected, customer, city, contact, and phone, I'll go ahead and click OK to create. And when I do that, I get a view panel control with 4 columns displayed. Designer automatically added a pager at the top of my view control. When I go to the properties, I can see the name that was generated, the ID, view panel 1. I can leave that as is or provide a more descriptive name. I could set an overall width for my view control. And this property here at runtime open selected document using, that's where you specify the XPage to use to open your documents when the user clicks on one of the links in the view. We'll come to that in the next part. On the Data tab, I can see the data source. So in my other application, the Customers application, the Customer by Name view is the data source for that view control. On the Display tab, I have some options here. I can choose to deselect this option here and not show column headers, but you probably want to do that. You automatically get the pager in the header. If you want one in the footer as well, you can check off that option to add a pager in the footer as well. And I can see that pager there. For now, I'll deselect that. We'll come back to that. This property here, maximum rows per page, one you'll probably want to set. So I'm going to set that to 10. I want to show 10 documents per page. And also under all properties, there are quite a number of properties that you can set for a view control. But for now, we'll leave those as is. And just on the Display tab, make sure I'm showing 10 rows per page. And I'll preview that and go ahead and save and compile that. And here's the result so far. My Customer by Name view, that data source, is being displayed in a view panel. that I added to the customer by name view.xspx page. And I can see the 4 columns, and I can see a pager that was added to the top. And I can page through these pages. And that's one thing I'm not too excited about. Notice how these column widths are expanding to fit the amount of data that's being shown on the various pages. So I may want to address that and hard code in the widths of some of those columns. But first, we'll return to the slides and look at our pager options. So this slide is showing us the 7 sample pagers that are supplied, pager sample 1 and sample 2 and sample 3 through 7. And in the example on the right, the types of controls you're going to get when you choose one of those predefined sample pagers. And if you don't like any of those predefined styles, you can create your own custom pager style with this interface. Returning to Designer, let's focus in on those pager options. So I can select this pager at the top of my view control, and I can see that by default it's using pager style sample 1, but I could choose that to one of the other sample styles. I'm going to leave that top one at pager sample 1, and instead I'll add a new pager to the bottom. So selecting my view control in my outline, and on the display tab, checking off to show pager and footer. So now I have a pager in the footer, and when I select that and look at its properties, so for pager 2, once again, we get the sample 1 style. I can choose sample 2 and get a little different set of controls, or sample 7, quite a full set of controls for paging through. Or I can create a custom pager. So I'll select custom. And to add a custom pager, you add the various controls in this left-hand box and move them over into the right-hand box. So first off, I'll select a first control and add that in the display in page, and I'll add previous and maybe the page selector where I see all the pages 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now I'll add a separator, and really I should have a separator on both sides of this page selector. So I'm going to move this one up, and let me reveal a little bit more of this interface. So I have controls on the right here for moving things up and down and deleting, so I'll move that up. And then add another separator after my selector. And then I'm going to add, actually I wanted previous there, so I've got previous in the wrong place. So I'm going to add the next control, and I'll move that up. So I really want first and then next, so let me move that next control up, and I'll move previous down, and I want to end with the previous and last control. So we'll add the last control. And that's enough to test out right now, so certainly different from my sample pager 1 at the top. So I'm going to preview and go ahead and save and compile, and there's the result. So I have a pager here at the bottom, and it's got all these controls, first, next, and previous, last, and I've got some separators separating my page selector, and I can choose these page selector or previous to go to page 2, next to go to page 3, and so on. I still have that problem where my columns are moving around. I've got that column jiggle as my column widths are expanding to show the data, so I do want to address that next. And this slide here shows where you set that width property. So with a view column selected in Designer or in your outline, you can get to the view column properties, and you can specify your units and hard code in the width for a particular column. With a view column header selected, you can access its properties, and that's where you would check off to sort the column if you want the sort control in the header. So my next changes will be to apply column sorting for the customer city and contact columns. But also, as I page through this, go to page 3, I can see that jiggle as I'm going to the various pages. So I want to address that next. But before I can, I need to see how wide some of these widest columns are. So Control-Shift-I to turn on my Chrome Developer Tools. And then I can select with my selector these various column cells. And I can see this one's about 181 pixels. So I might try 200 pixels for my customer column, and for this city column, I may get away with 100 or 150 pixels for that one. And for contact, probably 150 pixels for that. And for the phone column, that one there, I could get away with 100 pixels probably for that one. So I'm going to go with 200 and 150 for city and contact, and for that phone column, 100 pixels wide. Switching to Designer, first I'll select that customer column. I need to specify the units first before I can specify the width. So first I'll pick off pixels and then 250. Actually, I was going to set that to 200 pixels wide for that first column. And for city, we'll go with 150. Same for contact, 150. And for that phone column, we'll go with 100 pixels wide. When I select my column headers, I can choose to check off this option to sort this column and provide a sorting control on that. I can also check off this checkbox option to get a little box selector in my column header to select all of the entries, or I can go into my column properties, and on the display tab there is a checkbox option, and that will provide a box selector beside each view entry. Okay, so different ways to select the documents in your view. I'm going to disable both of those for now. In the city column header, I'm going to check off to sort the column, and the same for contact. When I go to the phone column header, that option is not enabled because the underlying column in the Domino View data source doesn't have that feature enabled, so can't check that off there. So let me preview that, and I'll save and compile. And now I can click on the headers to sort the contacts in ascending or descending order in the city. I'm not getting that jiggle as I'm sorting through the various top and bottoms. When I go through the pagers and select the different pages, I'm not getting that column jiggle as well, so that's been addressed. This concludes this part of our Intro to XPages Development series. In this part, we looked at displaying a domino view on our next page, and there are additional details in the lesson. You should also go on to complete the activity for this lesson. In the next part, we're going to take a look at displaying a domino document on our next page. And until then, so long for now.